Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host and presenter, Michael Dwyer, and our episode for the start of this new year is End of an Era, the Closing of Immaculate Heart of Mary Church. This is one of these events where current events meets history. And it's very difficult for us in the course of a 29-minute program to cram in 152 years of history. So at the beginning, I will recommend to you two sources that are available at the Rutland Historical Society website. The most recent, with a striking cover, is a Rutland Historical Society quarterly that was published in 1992. And that, in turn, drew a lot of information from another source, a typescript, that is also available at the Society website. And that was a history by Reverend Patrick T. Hannon, who wrote this in 1977. Father Hannon was a Rutland native, a member of the Rutland Historical Society, and his typescript history has a wealth of information with very specific details on building costs, the names of all the pastors, etc. To begin our story, we need to look at the creation of a church that was built primarily to meet the needs of the French-speaking population. And in this bird's eye view of Rutland, we see the area between Lincoln Avenue and Nichols Street, perpendicular to Grant Avenue. And we can see from this drawing the original wooden church, which was built in 1870 and was pretty well worn out by 1892. So even though there was the mother church in Rutland, St. Peter's, that had been founded in the 1850s, what was the specific need of a church to meet the needs of the French-speaking population? Here we have a period Bramer photo of the church, originally titled Sacred Heart of Mary, the new church, which was completed in 1894. And as far as the external features of the church are concerned, we can see that little has changed, with the exception that the house to the north and the house to the south have been taken down. And I will say more about that a little bit later. One of the things that we need to understand, which many older people simply take for granted, what did it mean to have a French Mass and French devotions? So it's beyond the scope of this program, and indeed we'll have a sequel to this episode, to look at the various stages of immigration from French Canada into Rutland. But if one were to go into a church like Sacred Heart of Mary in the early 1870s, there was no such thing as a missalette. You had your prayer book. And the Tridentine Mass, the Mass before Vatican II, had all the prayers in Latin. And in this prayer book, which is open to the birth of our Lord, the Christmas liturgy, we can see that on the left-hand column, we have actually the prayers. Some of the prayers are in French, and then on the right-hand side in Latin. And then on page 347, we can see the beginning of the Gospel of John in Latin, in principio erat verbum, and then the same Gospel translated into French. So even though the Gospel was read in Latin, the sermon was always in the language of the people. So in churches where the gospel, where the sermon would have been rendered in English, French people would not have been able to understand that. But there's a whole other level that is going to be reflected in the culture of this church, and that's in the various devotions that were quite popular for many years before Vatican Council. One that we can see in the right-hand illustration is Stations of the Cross, Chemin de la Croix. And in this, the service prayers, which began in front of the altar, we have a devotional prayer, and then the priest would intone each station. The congregant would respond in Latin, and then there would be various prayers. So this is all part of a culture of what people expected to their church to experience when they had a French church. And this can be best summed up in what became a motto associated with French-Canadian immigration, which is La foi et la langue. And for many of these people, their faith and their language were interchangeable. They learned their prayers in French, and it was all part of how they understood their role as Catholics. And as increasing numbers of people continue to stream from Quebec into the United States, there was a real sense of loss among the Quebec clergy that people coming to America, unless they had and were supported by a French-speaking church, that they would lose their faith. The person who gets the greatest amount of credit for the founding of the parish in 1870 was a man named Father Louis Gagné. And he was responsible for the initial gathering of the parish, the purchases of the property, and the building of the initial church. He was only here for about a year and a half, and most of the Vermont Catholic histories note that he left in the early 1870s, but I was very curious as to what happened to him. So I tracked him down because after he left Rutland, he went to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he remained until his death in 1908. And here we have a page from the Boston Globe that has a prominent obituary in it with his picture. And one of the striking facts I noted about his obituary is that he was one of 24 children born to one father. His mother bore 18 children. From the Rutland Historical Society Quarterly, we have some wonderful interior pictures of the church. So this one dates from 1900, and you can see the gas chandeliers. There's much that's recognizable about the paintings behind the altar, but very typical of the pre-Vatican II era, we can see the communion rail. By 1939, the church had been redecorated, more brightly painted. You can notice, and I'll say more about this in a little bit, you can see along the north wall, between the stained glass windows, we have the Stations of the Cross. We also see in one of the windows a statue of Thérèse of Lisieux, one of the most popular saints of the early 20th century. And this is all part of the various devotional practices when people would go into the church. Even when Mass was not being said, they would have their own private devotions. By 1940, there was a new marble altar that was to remain in place for more than 50 years. Statues were removed in many instances after Vatican II. And one of the things that is still recognizable and we'll see in color pictures is there are 3 large paintings, canvas paintings, that are behind the high altar. The one at left shows Pope Pius IX, who was the Pope from 1846 until 1878, the longest pontificate in modern history, and he is kneeling before the Blessed Mother. And the significance of that is, in 1856, he issued a decree about the obligatory devotion to the Sacred Heart. The Sacred Heart being at the center of the Catholic faith, and this was associated with a feast in the Universal Church. So even though the church was originally named Sacred Heart of Mary, it's this mystical association with the heart of Jesus, with the heart of Mary. Directly over the high altar, we have a painting of Mary being assumed into heaven, and at right we have a scene of the Nativity. Now, with each of these paintings, I learned that the man who painted it was named Richer. He was trained in Paris, but in particular with the image that we see at right of the Holy Family, I think what actually happened was this, is that church paintings could be ordered from Italy, and probably what would come via mail would be a canvas roll or a stencil, because in the painting of the Nativity, I have seen that in at least 3 or 4 other churches in New England. So although Richer gets the credit for being the artist, I think he followed something that resembled a template. And we can see all these years later of how well these paintings have held up. And you can more clearly see in color Pope Pius kneeling with his red cape, and we can certainly see the halos around Mary and Joseph at right. This is a house on Lincoln Avenue to the south of the church, and this was one of the properties that was later acquired. This property was raised, and this would be the site of Immaculate Heart of Mary School. And at this point, I think I need to explain how a name change came about. The cornerstone of the front of the present building from 1892 says Le Cœur Sacré de Marie, the formal name, the Sacred Heart of Mary. French masses existed until the late 1940s, but is kind of a reorientation of the church as a more inclusive parish church. The name was changed to Immaculate Heart of Mary. And the house that you just saw was torn down, and this is the location of where the school would exist for more than 2 decades. The house that you see immediately above Fabian's Derrick is 13 Nichols Street, which for many years served as a rectory before another house was acquired on Lincoln Avenue. And this house that you see at 13 Nichols Street later became apartment houses. The second floor of this house was one large apartment. The first floor was divided into 2 apartments, and this building was knocked down a number of years ago. The building that you see at right served for many years as a convent for the nuns who came to teach at the school. We have a 1950 photograph here with Bishop Ryan wearing his mitre. The ceremony for the digging of the foundation of the school. We can see at his on his right, at our left, we can see Father Alfred Desitel, who was responsible for the founding of the school. And at right, holding his biretta, is Monsignor Valentin Melhuca, who had been instrumental in bringing the Felician sisters. So he knew something about Catholic education because St. Stanislaus Kostka Parish in West Rutland had a school. Father Desitel had a sister who was a nun. I don't know which sister this is in particular, but prior to Vatican II, the school sisters of Notre Dame had very distinct habits. And of course, all these old habits were rooted in the daily garb of the late Middle Ages of France. We have a picture here taken in the school gym in 1954. So as people watch this, there is an indication that people may tell us who some of these people are. We have a photo, courtesy of Ray Mooney here, of the kindergarten class in 1959. And on the right-hand side, once again, we can see Father Desitel, whose early years were taken up with the foundation of the school. And we have another picture here of the Immaculate Heart of Mary School class of 1961, and they would be flanked once again by Father Desitel, elevated to the domestic prelate at left and one of the school sisters of Notre Dame at right. The school closed in 1970. It was an era of many Catholic schools all over the country closing, primarily because of diminished enrollment, but probably much more due to a declining number of vocations to religious life, and many women religious who left in the aftermath of Vatican II. Another picture here, courtesy of Ray Mooney, of the Immaculate Heart of Mary School basketball team in 1960-1961. This is a good shot of the old rectory, 13 Nichols Street, with its awnings. And we have at right the rectory that served for many years, the rectory that was on Lincoln Avenue that was torn down. Now let's look at some pictures that I was fortunate to be able to take while I had access to the church last week, thanks to Laurie Routhier. One of the things that is just remarkable about Immaculate Heart is that its brightness. The church underwent a major renovation that was completed in 1984, while many of the old decorations were preserved. The interior walls were simplified with less stenciling, very, very bright. The altar space was configured so that there was a much broader sanctuary space in keeping with the norms from Vatican II. And this is a view that I took from the choir balcony. And this is looking up at the choir balcony with the beautiful rose window that we see here. And again, it was a relatively dark day when I took these pictures, but with the lights on, the place just emanated with brightness. Along each side of the church, so this would be the north wall, above the angels we have some Latin, and what I can read beginning from at right is Mater Dei ora pro nobis peccatoribus, which is part of the Hail Mary in Latin. And we have the organ console here. This is an organ that was built by the Russell Company. The original organ of the church was an Este organ from 1922, and it took about 8 years after the renovations were completed for this organ to be fully acclimatized to the church environment. There was a splendid organ rededication concert that I attended in 2002, and I know I am not alone in saying, from my experience of attending organ recitals in many area Rutland churches and singing in choirs, that IHM had the best acoustics. And part of this is not only the voicing of the organ pipes, but also in the way that the interior reflected sound. Another view of the south wall of the church, and more Latin inscriptions here, so we can see closest to the organ in Latin, petite et accipietus, which means seek and ye shall find. I'm fascinated by the windows of Immaculate Heart, and these definitely went in two phases. So the earlier windows are the filigree windows, and these would be largely sponsored by donors. So perhaps in another program, I will be able to tell us who Jean-Baptiste Germain is, as well as Ed and Joseph Leroux. These windows certainly date from the early days of the church, and you'll see in a moment how the more elaborate windows came a little bit later. We have another example here of two windows. The first was probably for the memory of Dr. Alderic Belrose. I found his obituary from the Rutland Herald in 1931. He donated for the sum of $10 a property that allowed for some parking to the church. So if this was a memorial either that he specifically sponsored or in his memory, it's from the 1930s. And the window that we can see at right of Dr. Belrose is from Les Canadiens to West Rutland, because Immaculate Heart had a mission to West Rutland and a small wooden church that existed for many years. We have a beautiful example here of a Station of the Cross, number 13. And this is very much in a early Renaissance style in which the gold background signified something heavenly. And often in the original mosaics of these church, these were actually finished in gold. And it's interesting because in the early days of the church, the framing of the Stations of the Cross were much more elaborate, and from the renovation from 1940 onward, they were much more simply, in my opinion, much more dramatically framed in wood. We have windows here for Léon Leblanc and Jean-Baptiste Laporte. And again, to show you that in this church, as it grew, it was not only serving the needs of French Canadians, because here we have a window in memory of James Hanrahan, and then the window at right is from John D. and James Hanrahan. And it's hard for us to believe in a parish that dwindled down to several dozen families that in its heyday, Immaculate Heart of Mary would have served well over 2,000 people. One of the unique architectural features of Immaculate Heart, and this is where I wanted to juxtapose the exterior of the church with the stained glass windows. Certainly, this is reminiscent of French Gothic churches. And where you would have in large medieval cathedrals a transept for a cruciform floor plan, we can see that from the tower you have the first 3 windows that are of the same side. And then we have the beginning of a transept which has the stained glass window and a rose window over it. And these were much more elaborate. And what we have in this window is one of the key things that's part of the background of the name of the church, because we have the apparition of the Sacred Heart to a French nun named Margaret Mary Alcock. And these visions were somewhat questioned by the church, but after authenticating the power of these visions, it was Pope Pius IX in his promulgation of the Sacred Heart that elevated this French nun to the status of beatification. And curiously, Margaret Mary Alcock was canonized in 1920, the same year as Joan of Arc. And I think that is a response during World War I to the devotion to the Sacred Heart. And this very important window was donated by Flavier Lheureux. I may say more about him in a future program because he was a veteran of the Civil War. And I think this also honored, as you can see, under Margaret Mary Alcock, the Sisters of St. Joseph. On the north side of the church, we see a similar configuration. I didn't quite aim my iPad high enough to see this window, but it differs from the others because of the thickness of the wall. And this window has the baptism of Jesus, and it was sponsored by the St. John the Baptist Society. The other thing that we see about this environment is that the later windows were much more illustrative of faith and devotional stories that reinforce the personal piety of the people worshiping there. And at the right-hand altar prior to Vatican II, there was a statue of Saint Anne, an enormously popular French-Canadian devotion from Saint Anne de Beaupré. And we have here in the window, written in French, Saint Anne instructing the Holy Virgin. In the window that I photographed at right was the apparition of the angel to Saint Joseph, telling him the miraculous story that Mary would have a child conceived by the Holy Spirit. Another wonderful example of an illustrative stained glass window is one that appears to the left of the choir balcony in the right-hand side of my illustration here. And this one says, St. Peter receives from Jesus the keys to the kingdom of heaven, the power of the keys. And again, this tells a whole faith story that people would know. We return to the altar and the three paintings that I spoke about earlier. And I was able to, just this morning, in fact, to have one last look at the exterior of the church. And the remarkable thing about this view, this would not have been possible just several years ago because I was standing on the site of where the old rectory was, and where you can see a slight elevation at left, those were garages from the rectory. And I have here one last walk down the aisle of Immaculate Heart, just eerie for me to be in this church alone, walking down the aisle towards the altar. And I have acknowledgments here for the people who contributed to this through their cooperation and resources that were made available. And certainly I hope that this particular program is a way for people to remember, to appreciate, and have a lasting memento of this church, so much a part of Rutland's culture for the last 150 years.